Welcome back once again to the Schmidt Show here on News Radio 1029 KARN. I am your host, Brad Schmidt. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. 501-403-KARN, 501-403-5276 is the phone number if you want to join the conversation, be a part of the discussion, weigh in on any of the things we're talking about. There's a lot going on. Of course, the big news of the day yesterday, Donald Trump convicted on 34 counts in the trial in New York concerning the story of Stormy Daniels and all of that nonsense. If you were not aware of that, I have to ask, where were you? It's been a pretty big story the last 24 hours. So a lot going on with that. We'll talk, of course, about that today, I'm sure. But I want to talk about other stuff, too, because I don't want to spend all day on that because there really is other stuff happening in the world. There really is other things going on. So we'll get into that. But it's also Free Speech Friday. So anything you want to talk about today is fair game. We'll answer any questions. We can do an Ask Me Anything kind of deal. I don't know if you've ever heard of these they do them on Reddit is where I first was introduced to them, and Ask Me Anything where you can, some either celebrity or, some person an expert in a particular field will do an Ask Me Anything, and people can submit questions and then they answer them. So, feel free to ask me any question you're curious about as well, whether it's about me personally, about anything you're curious about. We'll do our best to answer them with as much candidness and honesty as possible. There is, of course, other news stories out there. There's still a war going on over in Ukraine. That's still happening. There's still a presidential election coming up in November. Beyond all of the crazy and the nonsense that's going on with all of this, that election is still going to take place. Donald Trump is still going to be the candidate. Donald Trump is still going to be the Republican nominee. At this point, there's nothing that's going to change about that. Whether he's convicted of a felony, whether he is acquitted on appeal or any of that, it doesn't really change anything. He's still going to run for president. In fact, I've got a little bit of a history lesson on this. Everybody is talking about, this unprecedented thing that's going on, and it certainly is rare, but it's not the only time a presidential candidate has been arrested. It's not the only time a presidential candidate has been convicted of a crime. And in fact, there is a story of the very first president to have ever been arrested, all the way back in 1872. So it is not it's not the only time this has ever happened. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of presidents and presidential candidates being elected, being arrested and convicted and even thrown in jail. There was a presidential candidate in 1918 that actually spent some time in jail for free speech issues. So we'll get into all of that. A few questions here. A few text messages have already come in. What are the crimes/laws broken for which Trump received these 34 convictions? I can find a mountain of articles about the hush money case or the election interference case, but I can't find anything that states outright actual laws Trump broke. Well, and that was part of the problem with the case. That was part of the arguments that were being made about the jury instructions. So as I understand it, and again, I'm not an attorney, so don't take my word as gospel on this, but as I understand it, the jury instructions that were given were, and I'm paraphrasing, and so if I get this wrong and there's some sort of way to split hairs about this, feel free to correct me, but I'm not claiming absolute authority on this because I'm not 100%. But as I understand it, the instructions that were given is that there's these 34 counts. And while those 34 counts may not have individually been criminal, the combination of this count versus that count could have led to an underlying crime or some other crime that was committed and therefore that would be guilty. And so the idea was that if there were, say, and I'm just using this as an example, there were 3 counts adding up that caused another crime to be committed. Those 3 crimes, those 3 charges, if 4 people found him guilty on one, a different 4 jurors found him guilty on a second, and yet another different 4 jurors found him guilty on a third, they could kind of combine it and say that is a guilty verdict for this other crime that he committed. And so it was very confusing and all of that as to what, because essentially any 34 of these charges, which were basic for documents and falsifying documents or whatever they were, any of those 34 combined in some combination could have easily resulted in a unanimous guilty plea. So, of course, I wasn't in the jury room. I don't know what the deliberations were. I can almost promise you that over the next year or so, there's going to be at least one of those jurors that is going to cash in on this and write a book, a tell-all, and become a millionaire. I can almost guarantee you already that that's going to happen. And I would be very, very, very surprised if not all of those jurors are already in talks with publishers and already in talks with journalists to share their story and all of those things. So I would not be surprised to see any of that, maybe even earlier, maybe even before the election, an October surprise of some bombshell story by one of the jurors. I would not be surprised if that is something that comes out of this. So that's the other part of this whole story that's somewhat frustrating, is that there's going to be a bunch of people surrounding this case that become really, 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 really rich because of it. And that was not what the justice system was ever intended to be. Texter says, question, could Don Jr. run for president and then pardon Senior and then have him as a vice president and then step down and let Senior become president? He could. It's not necessary. Donald Trump can still run. There's nothing in the Constitution that prevents Donald Trump from running because of his conviction. And as I said, he's not the first presidential candidate that was convicted of a crime. So this is it doesn't change anything. And that's one of the things that I think needs to be spoken and people need to understand, because I think I'm afraid there may be people that will go to the ballot box in November and not vote for Trump because they think it will be a wasted vote because he's not allowed to run as a convicted felon, which is entirely untrue. So, yeah, I don't fall into the trap. Do not fall prey to the lie that this somehow disqualifies President Trump from running again. It doesn't do any such thing. He can keep running. He can continue to be the nominee. I can't believe the Republican Party will do anything to prevent him from doing that. And if they do, they're morons. And there's actually historical precedent that will show specifically that I'll talk about. They talked about a candidate being arrested back in 1918 when running against Calvin Coolidge, I think. Maybe it was I might be wrong on that one. But, yeah, he was arrested and actually ended up getting probably quite a few more votes than he would have otherwise. So if the Republican Party pulls the plug on Trump and tries to go with somebody else, they're idiots. That is the dumbest thing the Republican Party can do at this point. So, yeah, I mean, unless there's some new law passed that I'm not aware of or some constitutional amendment that I did not understand or whatever, yeah, Donald Trump can still run. So 501-403-KRN, 501-403-5276. More text messages to get to, more of your phone calls. We'll take those as well as we continue here on News Radio 102.9 KRN. It's Free Speech Friday, live from the LeVar Law Studios on KRN.